Welcome to Exploring LDS History. I think we are on session 11 this morning. Thank you for being here, where we are doing our very best every week to look at the history of the LDS Church, and particularly the founding and the founders of the church, and do so in a way that is honest, but at the same time loving and gracious. And so my intent in this is not to be mean-spirited, even though I will be critical of a lot of LDS doctrine and LDS teaching. I hope I can follow the encouragement of Scripture. I want my speech to be gracious as much as I possibly can, even though we may disagree, because these issues we're talking about are significant and they are eternal. And so if you're here this morning and you have an LDS background, or you're watching online and you have an LDS background, we want you to know that we love you, and we'd love to sit down and talk to you and reason through some of these things together. And I believe we are able to disagree without being disagreeable. And I hope I'm able to pull that off as we work through some of these important issues together every week. Where the last few weeks we kind of worked through the history of the founding of the church up to the publication of the Book of Mormon and the official founding of the church. And then the last few weeks we've been looking at kind of the Book of Mormon internally to see if it holds up as an inspired document. And so we've looked at issues like the fact that just at face value, the Book of Mormon appears to read like a document that was written in the early 19th century, and it addresses 19th century issues like what happened to the Native Americans, how did they get here, and what happened to the people that were here before. And it addresses current issues of the day like the Masons and infant baptism and all sorts of issues that were big issues in the 1830s. It seems to address those issues rather than ancient issues that the book purports to be about. We looked at issues like with the Book of Mormon borrowing from sources like Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews, which there are so many parallels between the two that it's hard to explain those away. We looked last week at the Book of Mormon's reliance on the King James Version of the Bible, and how there are huge chunks that are word for word brought over, including translators' errors and clarifications that come over word for word in the Book of Mormon. But the Book of Mormon's use of King James English, and particularly its poor use of King James English throughout. And so we've looked at several kind of internal consistency problems, and we're going to look at a few more today. But I want to begin today with this idea that Joseph Smith said the Book of Mormon was the most correct book on earth. And when we look at the Book of Mormon, does that claim hold up? And I did rely heavily today, and some of you will be familiar with this book, and many of you will be familiar with Gerald and Sandra Tanner. Gerald and Sandra Tanner came out of the LDS Church in the 60s, and they founded Utah Lighthouse Ministries in downtown Salt Lake, and they have spent the last 50 years doing historical research on the founding of the church and going through old documents and pouring through them. And if you do any kind of serious historical research on the LDS Church, you will run into Gerald and Sandra Tanner's work somewhere along the way. And I just saw this week that Gerald passed away a few years ago, and Sandra just retired this past week. And so they're actually closing the bookstore down in downtown Salt Lake. She's moving to a condo, and she just reached that age where she can't keep up anymore. They're going to keep their online presence and the website going, but the bookstore closed. So anyway, one of the books they wrote was this 3,913 changes in the Book of Mormon, where they went to the first published edition of the Book of Mormon in 1830, and they compared it to the modern edition. I believe the most recent revision was in 1981, and found that it has been changed 3,913 times. And so they just took and they marked everywhere there had been a change. And it's a great big massive book. It's not in print anymore, I don't believe. I have a copy floating around somewhere. If you have it, let me know, because I can't locate it. If I've loaned it to you, I don't know where it went. But I did rely heavily on them in working on this today. The difficulty is that according to Joseph Smith's own testimony, there should have been no need for any changes to ever be made to the Book of Mormon. By his own words, and this is when Joseph Smith went into the woods with the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon after they had finished translation. And when we get back to the historical narrative timeline in a couple weeks, we'll talk about the three witnesses. But he went in the woods with Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer, and the voice from heaven told them this regarding the book that they had just finished translating. Said, "We heard a voice from out of the bright light above us saying, 'These plates have been revealed by the power of God. They have been translated by the power of God, and the translation of them which you have seen is correct.'" So you've got God's stamp of approval. God saying, "You got it right, Joseph. This translation is correct." And this is recorded in the official history of the church, that this is what God told them. Joseph Smith also said in the history of the church, "I told the brethren that the Book of Mormon was the most correct book of any book on the earth." It's a pretty big claim to make. We could look at other church authorities like Joseph Fielding Smith, who, in answering these claims, and this would have been, he was the president of the church, so Joseph Fielding Smith was the son of Joseph F. Smith, who was a church president, and the great-nephew of Joseph Smith. And he was the president from 70 to 72 and was an apostle before that. In answer to these accusations that the Book of Mormon has been changed thousands of times, he said this: "During the past week or two, I have received a number of letters from different parts of the United States written by people, some of whom at least are a little concerned because they've been approached by enemies of the church and enemies of the Book of Mormon who have made the statement that there have been 1 or 2 or more thousand changes in the Book of Mormon since the first edition was published." And I just wanted to throw in there today, I hope I don't come across as an enemy of the church. And my reason in going through this and looking at the history is not because I hate the LDS church. It's not because I want to be antagonistic, but it is because I believe truth matters, and wherever we can find it. And so he said, though, in answer to these charges, there is no truth in that statement that the Book of Mormon has been changed. This would have been in the 1960s, he said. "It's true that when the Book of Mormon was printed, the printer was a man who was unfriendly." And I bring this up because the standard argument for many, many years was all of the changes that have been made in the Book of Mormon, you could attribute them to the fact that the printer messed up, right? He was unfriendly and antagonistic to the church, and so he did it. And so that's his view. The publication of the book was done under adverse circumstances, and there were a few errors, mostly typographical, conditions that arise in most any book that is being published. I agree. Those kind of things are going to happen. But there was not one thing in the Book of Mormon, or in the second edition, or any other edition since that, that in any way contradicts the first edition. And such changes were made by the prophet Joseph Smith because under those adverse conditions the Book of Mormon was published. But there was no change of doctrine. We'll see if that claim holds up in a few minutes. Now, these people making these claims are sons of Belial. These sons of Belial who circulate these reports evidently don't know better. I won't use the word that is in my mind. So that's a pretty strong statement. I'm not going to say what I'm really thinking. I kind of go, sons of Belial is pretty strong by itself. But he says, no changes have been made to the Book of Mormon. Does that statement hold true? Well, another Mormon historian, and you might remember B.H. Roberts from a few years ago. We haven't been doing this that long. A few weeks ago. Might seem like a few years ago. We met B.H. Roberts a few weeks ago. He was the historian, you might remember, who started comparing View of the Hebrews with the Book of Mormon and went to the general authorities with what he found, going, guys, what are we going to do? Because it seems obvious the Book of Mormon borrows. The stories just parallel too much for it to be a coincidence. and they kind of silenced him and sent him on his way and hushed up his work until the mid-1980s, long after he was gone, before it was ever published. So he's a historian and a believer in the Book of Mormon. And he recognizes these problems and these issues. And in studying it as a historian, he realizes this argument that all the changes are the result of an antagonistic publisher, that argument doesn't hold water. And here's what he said. The errors of grammar and faults in dictation do exist in the Book of Mormon, and more especially and abundantly in the first edition, that must be conceded. There was a lot. What's more, while some of the errors may be referred to inefficient proofreading, such as to be expected in a country printing establishment, yet such is the nature of the errors in question, and so interwoven are they throughout the diction of the book, that they may not be disposed of by saying they result from inefficient proofreading, or referring them to the mischievous disposition of the typos, or the unfriendliness of the publishing house. The errors are constitutional in their character. They are the web and woof of the style. And so he's saying you can't play this on the printer because this is the way the book was written. It's interwoven throughout the whole book, so you can't lay it on him going back and changing it. And these kinds of errors can't be classed as typographical. Indeed, the first edition of the Book of Mormon is singularly free from typographical errors. By that he means it's not the errors of the publisher that popped up in the book. We can't lay it at the feet of the publisher. He realizes that. After due allowance is made for all of these conditions, the errors are so numerous and of such a constitutional nature that they can't be explained away by these unfavorable conditions under which the work was published. He's saying we can't blame it on the publisher. Fortunately, though, we have some really good records as to exactly how the Book of Mormon was published. This man, John Gilbert, this picture was taken way late in his life. He was one of the printers of the Book of Mormon who lived to be in his 90s, lived well into the end of the 1800s. And he recalled very clearly his work in publishing the Book of Mormon and gave a really clear account of it. Here's how he said it went down. When the printer was ready to commence work, Martin Harris was notified, and you might remember Harris was the one footing the bill for all of this. He's mortgaged his farm. Harris was notified, and Hiram Smith, that's Joseph's brother, brought the first installment of the manuscript, 24 pages, closely written on common foolscap's paper. He had it under his vest, and vest and coat closely buttoned over it. At night, Hiram Smith came and got the manuscript, and with the same precaution carried it away. And the next morning, the same watchfulness, he brought it back, and at night he took it away, and he kept this up for several days. So he'd bring the manuscript in, closely guarded, they'd work on it, and he'd take it home at night. The title page was first set up, and after proof was read and corrected, several copies were printed for Harris and his friends. On the second day, Harris and Hiram Smith, being in the office, I called their attention to a grammatical error and asked whether I should correct it. Harris consulted with Smith for a short time and turned to me and said, "The Old Testament is ungrammatical. Set it as it's written. We're not going to fix it. Just print it." Martin Harris, Hiram Smith, Oliver Cowdery were very frequent visitors to the office during the printing of the Book of Mormon, or the Mormon Bible. The manuscript was supposed to be in the handwriting of Cowdery. Every chapter, if I remember correctly, was one solid paragraph without a punctuation mark from beginning to end. Names of persons and places were generally capitalized, but sentences had no end. The character or short "and" symbol was used almost invariably where the word "and" occurred, except at the end of a chapter. I punctuated it to make it read as I suppose the author intended, but very little punctuation was altered in proofreading. Cowdery held and looked over the manuscript when most of the prints were read, Martin Harris once or twice and Hiram Smith once. Grandin, supposing these men could read their own writing, Grandin's the printer, writing as well, if not better than anyone else, and if there are any discrepancies between the Palmyra edition, that's the first edition, and the manuscript, these men should be held responsible. So he's saying they signed off on all of it. They saw it all before it was published. They signed off. All right. All that's to say, What did that first published version of the Book of Mormon look like? Well, fortunately, we have the original manuscript. Joseph Smith placed the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon in the cornerstone of a house in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1841, and then it was lost for about 40 years before it was rediscovered in the 1880s, but by that time water had gotten to it and all but about 28% had been destroyed. But we have that 28%. And we also have Oliver's Cowdery's, the printer's manuscript, the copy that they took to the printer. And I believe it's still on display downtown in Salt Lake at the historical building. If you wanted to go look at it, they have it displayed down there. So anyway, here's just a sample of the Book of Mormon manuscript and what that original English that it went in as looked like. And I won't read this whole paragraph, but you can see all of those. This lines up perfectly with what we just read from the printer's description. It's one giant long run-on sentence. Everywhere it should be the word "and," it's just the "and" symbol. There's no punctuation, there's no commas. There's a lot of misspelled words like imaginations there. So it was just almost unreadable in that first edition in terms of punctuation and grammar. Here's just one example, a copy of one page of that first published edition. And there's still 1830 editions of the Book of Mormon. That first run, there was 5,000 printed. There's still copies floating around out there. This is one page where Gerald and Sandra Tanner, you can see they marked all the changes that have been made. Almost all of them, by the way, I'll grant, of the 4,000 changes, almost all of them are grammatical. They're fixes in spelling. It's words that are misspelled or repeated or just poor grammar. That's the vast majority of them are those kinds of changes. For instance, there's a continual use of an unnecessary "a" before participles. I'll show you all these in just a second. The use of "no" instead of "any," so a lot of double negatives. Past participles incorrectly, not using the past tense correctly. And even if you're not an English scholar, when I show them to you, you'll go, well, that's not right, okay? So here's some examples of the kinds of things that first version said. Moroni was a-coming against them. It's that kind of English, right? You can look at that and go, that's not the right way to write that. I was a-journeying to see a very near kindred, and I was a-going hither. They did not fight against God no more. I have not sought gold nor silver, nor no manner of riches of you. This he done that he might subject them. And they had begun to possess the land of Amulon and had begun to till, and they had began, to possess the land of Amulon and had began to till the ground. Both Alma and Helam was buried in the water. They was angry with me when they had a riven in the border of the land. The Lamanites did gather themselves together for to sing. They did cast up mighty heaps of earth for to get ore. We depend on them for to teach us the word. And on we could go with those kind of examples, which you all hear that and you go, that's just not good English, right? It's just bad English. But it does sound like, you know what it sounds like to me? It does sound a lot like the way my grandfather from West Virginia, who grew up very rural, it sounds a lot like the way he talked. It sounds a lot like the way my wife's grandfather, who grew up in rural Missouri, the way he talked. So that kind of leads me to the question, does that read like a book that was miraculously translated through the power of God, or does it read like the product of a largely uneducated rural young man living in the 1820s? And I'm not faulting Joseph Smith for that, by the way. I'm not faulting him for talking that way. I'm not faulting him for having rural speech. But I'm just saying, on face value, when you read those kinds of phrases, this sounds like a country person writing in the way a country person speaks, doesn't it? And with not great English. Well, why would that be a problem? Who cares if Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon in country English and they cleaned it up afterwards? Maybe God just allowed him to translate that way, right? As Christians, our view of inspiration on the New Testament, I wouldn't have a problem with that. We believe that when the New Testament writers wrote, that they wrote with their personality and their education level. So when I read the Gospel of John, in my college Greek, our final was we had to translate the book of 1 John from Greek to English. And the reason they had us do 1 John is because it's the easiest, most simple Greek in the entire New Testament. And so that makes sense for a guy who'd been a fisherman, right? John's Greek is not super polished. Where you read Luke, who was very educated, it is. So what's a big deal if Joseph Smith didn't write very polished English? Who cares if there were mistakes? The problem is the LDS view of how we got the Book of Mormon doesn't allow for that view. You can't explain away the difficulties by saying that Joseph Smith was rural and uneducated. And you can't explain away, like some modern LDS scholars try to do, by saying that God just gave him the concepts and let Joseph Smith write them down in his own words. That's not what the history says happened. That's not what the LDS Church authorities taught for well more than 100 years. They taught that God gave him the translation. And we've looked at this by Whitmer before, but just to emphasize, and David Whitmer is one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, who was there when Smith was translating. He finished up work of translating at Whitmer's house. Whitmer said, "I will give you a description of the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. Joseph Smith would put the stone into his hat, he'd put it to his face, he'd draw it around his face to exclude the light, and a piece of something resembling parchment would appear. And on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English." And all the sources agree on this. Like Smith never looked at the plates. He would look in his hat, and God would show him a line of the hieroglyphics, and he would show him a line of the translation underneath. Then Brother Joseph would read off the English to Cowdery, who was his scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another with the interpretation would appear. Thus the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and the power of God, and not the power of any man. God gave it to him a line at a time, and he wouldn't give him the next line until the previous line was right. Sometimes Joseph couldn't pronounce the words correctly, having but little education, and if by any means a mistake was made in the copy, the luminous writing would remain until it was corrected. God wouldn't give them if Cowdery wrote something down wrong, God wouldn't move on until they got it right. It sometimes took Oliver several trials to get the right letters to spell correctly some of the more difficult words. But when he had written them correctly, the characters and the interpretation would disappear and be replaced by other characters and their interpretation. So that's pretty clear. God wouldn't give it to him until it was right. Martin Harris, who was also there at the time and served as scribe part of the time, he said essentially the same thing. By aid of the seer stone, sentences would appear and were read by the prophet and written by Martin. When finished, he would say written, and if correctly written, that sentence would disappear and another would appear in its place. But if not written correctly, it remained until corrected, so that the translation was just as it was engraved on the plates, precisely in the language then used. So he says the same thing. God wouldn't let them move on until they got it right. And this was the teaching of the church for well more than 100 years after the church was founded. This was the way it was translated. This was the process. Here's a general authority, George Reynolds, from the late 1800s, where he says essentially the same thing. The translation of the characters appeared on the Urim and Thummim, sentence by sentence, and as soon as one was correctly transcribed, the next would appear. So that they were consistent in saying this until, and some still would, but it's become a very hard position to defend in modern days because we know it's been changed so much. And then lastly, we have Joseph Smith in his own words. This is in the preface to the first version of the Book of Mormon, where he says, "I translated this by the gift and the power of God." So that does, if that is the process through which we got the Book of Mormon, that does leave us with some very big problems. Because that means God has bad English and that God can't spell. and that God can't write correctly from ancient Reformed Egyptian into English, that is a bit of a problem if the process we just read about was true. So how is it possible that God's responsible for the Book of Mormon, and yet there are so many mistakes? Well, to go back to our friend B.H. Roberts again, he realized this was a problem. And I admire Roberts, if nothing else, for his honesty in wrestling with these things, going, we got a problem. And he was a faithful Mormon. He didn't want to walk away from the church, but in wrestling with this, he goes, this is an issue. And he realized we're laying blame at the foot of God here. Here's what he said. If the Book of Mormon is a real translation, instead of a word-for-word bringing over from one language into another, and it is insisted that the divine instrument, the Urim and the Thummim, did all, and the prophet nothing, at least nothing more than to read off the translation made by the Urim and Thummim, right, which is what we just saw they said, then the divine instrument, God, is responsible for such errors in grammar and diction as did occur. But this is to assign responsibility for errors in language to a divine instrumentality, which amounts to assigning error to God. And that's unthinkable, not to say blasphemous. And he's right, isn't he? He's exactly right. He realizes the consequences of this. Also, if it be contended that the language of the Book of Mormon, word for word and letter for letter, was given to the prophet by direct inspiration of God, acting upon his mind, then again God is made responsible for the language errors in the Book of Mormon, and that is a thing unthinkable. Rather than ascribe these errors to deity, either through direct or indirect means, men will reject the claims of the Book of Mormon. And since the verbal errors in the Book of Mormon are such as one ignorant of the English language would make, if Joseph Smith was writing it himself, the temptation is strong in the minds of those not yet converted to its truth to assign to the Book of Mormon an altogether human origin. And I agree with him. The temptation for me is strong when I read this to go, I don't think that came from God. That just seems like something that was written from a human origin. I have a hard time buying the idea that God gave it to him word for word and that this is the product. I think God would be a better writer than that. I don't think God would make mistakes. And so, as one not converted to the truth, I do come to that conclusion. And Roberts was wrestling with this himself. And he did eventually, he was kind of one that came, he wanted to move more towards this kind of idea that God just gave him the concepts and Joseph Smith could still write, and that's why there's so many errors. The problem is that's not what any of the history says or what anybody said for more than 100 years. So, all that's to say, it is a big deal that there's 3,900 grammatical errors in the Book of Mormon that had to be fixed. Is it a huge deal? I don't know. You can decide. Maybe it's not a huge deal, but I do think the implications of that are significant if it was translated the way the founders of the church said it was translated. But what would be much more of a big deal if there had been changes made in the Book of Mormon that affected LDS theology or doctrine. So we're not talking about fixing grammar errors or putting in commas or fixing spell words or, correcting double negatives. It's just poor writing. But does the doctrine of the Book of Mormon change? There are a few places where it does. And what's interesting about these is, so Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830 when he would have been, theologically, his perspective would have been a Trinitarian monotheist, just like us, right? There's one God in three persons. But his theology evolved over time to where by the end of his life, he would not have been. Right? He came to teach later on that Jesus was not the eternal God, that he was a created being, and we'll get to all of this. So his theology changed. And so when he revised the Book of Mormon, and all the changes in 1837, that first revision, they were all made by Joseph Smith. When he revised it in 1837, we see some changes like this, where 1 Nephi 11 originally says that Jesus was the everlasting God. When he revised the Book of Mormon a few years later, That's changed to that Jesus is the Son of the everlasting God. That may not seem like a huge deal, but if you understand LDS theology, the difference in what they mean by that, that's a huge difference in the two. And again, if it was correct the first time, you shouldn't have to go in and add any words to clarify later, right? If God signed off on it and said, you got it right, what's he doing fiddling with it? He shouldn't have been fiddling with it. It was already right. We see similarly, 1 Nephi 13:40 originally said that Jesus is the eternal Father. That's changed later to the Son of the eternal Father. 1 Nephi 11 said that Mary was the mother of God. And that was changed in 1837 to Mary being the mother of the Son of God. And so we see changes to reflect changes in their theological viewpoints as you move through. This one I think is very interesting. In 1830, this is a direct quote from Isaiah 48, I believe, if I remember right. So from 1840, it just quotes exactly how it is in the King James Version of the Bible in English. And it wasn't until 1964. Why would you need to make this change 135 years later? In 1964, they add to the text of Isaiah the words, there come forth out of the waters of Judah or out of the waters of baptism. And I think that's to, if you're familiar with Eliot, you know how important baptism is and all of baptism for the dead, all that goes on with LDS theology. And they also want, I think, to teach that people in the Old Testament were practicing baptism. And so it seems to me like this is added to try to give credence to that claim that Old Testament peoples were practicing baptism. These ancient Nephites were practicing baptism at the time. And so it seems like that's been added in. But what an interesting thing to add a whole phrase 130 years later. This one's really interesting that in 1830, Alma 29:4 says, Yea, I know that he allotteth unto men, yea, decreeth unto them, decrees which are unalterable. In 1837, Joseph Smith took out the part about decrees of God being unalterable, which I find interesting because God has altered a lot of decrees in LDS theology over the years. Until 1978, if you were African American, you could not hold priesthood in the LDS church. From 1830 to 1978, when God altered the decree and said, yes, they can. Right? Brigham Young and some of the early fathers of the church taught that you could not gain exaltation unless you practiced polygamy. You have to practice polygamy if you want to gain exaltation, until it became clear that Utah was never going to become a state because of polygamy, and then God said, yeah, we can alter that. So I find it interesting that that was taken out, and Joseph Smith took that out in 1837, and I don't know the reason for this. And so it wasn't there from 1837 all the way till 1981, which I believe is the most current revision, when it found its way back in to the Book of Mormon again, which I just find to be kind of interesting. A lot of other changes we could talk about. For instance, Mosiah 21:28 originally said King Benjamin had a gift from God. Ether 4:1 also talked about King Benjamin. And the problem is, and they realized this at some point, they started doing the math and the chronology of the Book of Mormon. And when these verses are taking place in the Book of Mormon, King Benjamin had been dead for a long time already. And so that couldn't be right? And so the 1837, Joseph Smith had worked out, oops, that doesn't make any sense. He's already dead, has been dead for a while. So it's changed to King Mosiah in versions since then. This, I think, is interesting just because it totally changes the meaning of the passage. Alma 37, 21, and 24 talks about them using directors. And the directors were basically, if I understand it, it was like a compass, right? It was this round ball that you would put in a spindle, and God would use it to direct them and guide them through these essentially a compass, if I understand it right, but this kind of divine compass. And later editions, it stayed that way till 1888. Until 1888, they changed it to interpreters. And the interpreters refers to the Urim and Thummim, according to the footnote in the LDS Study Bible I was looking at. And so that's two totally different things and two totally different items. So I find that interesting. Maybe one of the most famous changes is that Nephi 36 originally said that the Nephites were a white and delightsome people. And 1981, that was cleaned up a little bit to say a pure and delightsome people. And this is not part of the inspired text. I just mentioned this because these are talked about so much. That the Lamanites, this is in the chapter heading, and for 2 Nephi 5, said, because of their wickedness, the Lamanites received a skin of blackness. And it's talking about Native Americans there, that they were cursed with dark skin because of their wickedness. That's cleaned up a little bit. That's not very politically correct in later editions. And so that should say 1981 edition at the top of that one. It was cleaned up to say they were cut off from the presence of the Lord, which is entirely different. The same thing for Mormon chapter 5. Originally, the chapter heading said the Lamanites will be dark, filthy, and loathsome people. And that chapter heading is cleaned up to be, because of their unbelief, the Lamanites will be scattered. So it's totally different. It's interesting to me, though, that they cleaned up some of those chapter headings describing it, but they haven't yet cleaned up all of the information in the chapters, because Mormon chapter 5, verse 15 still says that the Lamanites are a dark, filthy, and loathsome people, which doesn't come across really well in modern ears. But you got to remember, and a lot of LDS scholars will admit this, that the Book of Mormon is a racist book, in that the Nephites are very racist against the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. Right? The Nephites are the righteous people, the Lamanites are the wicked people, and the Nephites are very racist, and so that's reflected a lot in the Book of Mormon. But from one perspective, the Book of Mormon is essentially written for the Lamanites. That the LDS Church is a restorationist movement. We are going to reach the Lamanites, which is Native Americans. We're going to reach the Native Americans, these dark, savage, filthy people. We're going to reach them for Jesus, and that's going to usher in the millennium. And that was the thought when the church was founded. The first missionaries Smith sent out were missionaries to Missouri to go reach the Lamanites, to go reach the Native Americans. That's going to usher in the kingdom as soon as we reach them. And so you see that idea kind of reflected in the text of the Book of Mormon. So, all that's to say, in the end, just what we've looked at in the last couple weeks, in light of the fact that the Book of Mormon seems to be answering all the questions that were being asked in the early 19th century, in light of the fact that there are unexplainable similarities between the Book of Mormon in view of the Hebrews, the book by Ethan Smith, in light of the fact that the Book of Mormon tries and fails to capture King James English. And again, if it was any one of these things, maybe I could go, okay, all right, I see that, right? But when you look at all of these things together, in light of the fact that it quotes extensively from the King James Version, word for entire chapters, in light of the fact that there are striking similarities between Alma and the Apostle Paul that we looked at last week, in light of the fact that the original text that was translated by the power of God and declared to be correct by the voice of God, that text has had to have 4,000 changes. What seems more plausible to you? In light of all of that, is it more plausible that the Book of Mormon was a work miraculously translated through the power of God? Or is it more plausible, in light of all of that it was the product of an uneducated young man living in the 1820s? Which to me is exactly how it reads when I read it. I'll leave you to make those decisions for yourself. We'll spend one more week next week looking at some of the internal issues with the Book of Mormon, and then we will jump back into the historical timeline and move forward from the founding of the church. Thank you for being here. Let's pray, and we will be dismissed.